morning, Grace Church. Let me start with a confession. I've been married long enough now to learn something really important. I don't always have to have the last word. Now, to be clear, I didn't say that I've accepted that fact or that I've mastered it, just that I've learned it. There's a big difference. Because if I'm honest, there's something deep in my soul that wants to finish every strong conversation with a strong statement. Like, I don't want to just talk about it. I want to land the plane. I want to drop the mic with epic background music. I want Brittany sitting there like, wow, that was incredibly compelling. And my favorite words ever, he's so right. But what actually happens is I say one more thing I probably didn't need to say. And suddenly I'm sleeping slightly closer to the edge of the bed. Turns out in marriage, having the last word is not the same thing as winning. Sometimes it's just losing more confidently. And the more I've paid attention to that in my life, the more I've realized it's not just a marriage issue, it's a me issue. Because I feel it everywhere. When I'm misunderstood, when someone disagrees with me, when someone is just clearly, downright, plain wrong, and I've been called by God to help them see that, there's something in me that wants to jump in, to speak up, to defend, to clarify, to correct, to win. Maybe you're like me. And the crazy part is we all know better. I understand what my grandma used to say. God gave us 2 ears, but only one mouth. I get that. I understand it for a reason. I've even heard some of these mantras. Let's try a few of them. If you don't have anything nice to say, don't say anything at all. Best I can tell, Thumper and Bambi was the first one to say that, and that's what I'm going to stick to. Or how about this one? Better to remain silent and be thought a fool than to speak and remove all doubt. Equal credit there given to President Lincoln and Mark Twain. Speak when you are angry and you will make the best speech you will ever regret. Or how about this one? The tongue has no bones, but it is strong enough to break a heart. Oof. I've heard those statements and more. The problem is I just struggle to put them into practice. And the Bible has a lot to say about this too that I struggle with equally. Here's a couple of examples in Proverbs. Those who guard their mouths and their tongues keep themselves from calamity. It's true. I just sometimes don't keep myself from calamity. Death and life are in the power of the tongue. I know these. I've studied them. It's just hard for me to keep them. I want the powerful last word. And my guess is I'm not alone. James, the half-brother of Jesus, describes our dilemma this way. He says, all kinds of animals, birds, reptiles, and sea creatures are being tamed and have been tamed by mankind, but no human being can tame the tongue. It is a restless evil full of deadly poison. Now, ain't that the truth? But also, think about what he said at the first part of that. Stop and think about what we're capable of as human beings. It's pretty incredible. We can get on a plane and be on the other side of the world in a matter of hours. I can text my friend Mick in Jerusalem this morning and hear back from him instantly. The smartphone in my pocket has more power than the rocket that sent the astronauts to the moon. We've figured out how to treat diseases, build complex systems, keep pushing technology forward at a pace that's hard to even keep up with. In so many ways, the human race is pretty incredible. And yet for all of that progress, all of that knowledge, there's one really basic, simple thing that we consistently struggle to get right. Knowing when to speak and when to be quiet. It sounds simple, but it's not. Not in real life, not in the moment, because in the moment I want to say something. I want to clarify, defend, explain, make sure that I'm understood, maybe even make sure that I'm right. I think that's why I'm so drawn to Jesus in these final moments of his earthly life. Because when everything is on the line, when he's being questioned and accused and misunderstood, he shows a kind of restraint that just frankly doesn't come easily for me. There are moments that he speaks with clarity and conviction, and then there are moments when he says nothing at all. And every time I read the story of the Passion, I'm reminded of how much I still have to learn. Because even as someone who wants to tend to have the last word, these stories of Jesus leave me in silence. Let me remind you where we've been in this series, Passion. We've been walking through Holy Week, the final week of Jesus' earthly life. We've watched him enter Jerusalem with his disciples as the city begins to fill up for Passover. In the middle of that week, we've joined them around a table where Jesus begins to reframe everything. He tells them that a different kind of deliverance is coming, not like Moses leading the people out of Egypt, but something much deeper than that. He's talking about rescue from sin and evil, from the brokenness inside of us. And he gives them this meal, what we call the Lord's Supper, as a way to remember what he's about to do and the new covenant that he's establishing. And then from there, the tone shifts. Jesus kneels down and he washes his disciples' feet. And he goes then with Peter, James, and John deep into the Garden of Gethsemane, and that place where olives are pressed and crushed. You see the weight of what's coming start to press in on Jesus. He tells his followers, my soul is overwhelmed to the point of death. He's not pretending. He's not detached. He's honest about the cost of what's about to happen. And yet he prays with total surrender. He trusts the Father's will even as the cross is getting closer. After that prayer, everything starts to move really fast. Judas shows up. Jesus is arrested. He's taken to the high priest Caiaphas' house. The city starts buzzing with rumors. Peter denies that he even knows him. And somewhere in the middle of that night, Jesus is beaten and mocked. And he's likely held in a pit, a dark cell beneath the home of the high priest. And what we're going to look at today, what comes next, is a series of trials that are honestly, they're a mess. They're rushed, they're inconsistent, they're driven by an outcome that's already been decided. But what stands out in the middle of this isn't what happens to Jesus, it's how he responds. Because in these moments, Jesus, who knows everything, who could say anything, who could dismantle and destroy every argument, shows us what it looks like to have complete control over his words. He knows when to speak, and he knows when to be quiet. Usually we save the big idea of the message till the end, but before we dive into the trials, I want to give you the sermon in one sentence because we're going to unpack it together. Here it is. With Jesus, I can live with nothing to lose, nothing to hide, and nothing to prove. This is going to be really important for us, so let's say this together. With Jesus, I can live with nothing to lose, nothing to hide, nothing to prove. Throughout the Gospels, but particularly in Luke's Gospel, where we're going to be today, Luke pays special attention to the fact that Jesus is innocent of every charge that's thrown at him. Not even the corrupt and competing judicial systems of first century Israel and Rome can find evidence to support their claims. Even the governor from Rome, Pontius Pilate, says over and over that Jesus is innocent of any crime. And other witnesses to Jesus' life say that he was without sin of any kind. So we're going to break down the appearance of Jesus in three successive trials, or four scenes, if you will. So here's scene one: Jesus before the Sanhedrin, or living with nothing to lose. Let's join Luke's story. At daybreak, all the elders of the people assembled, including the leading priests and the teachers of religious law. Jesus was led before this high council, and they said, "Tell us, are you the Messiah?" But he replied, "If I tell you, you won't believe me. And if I ask you a question, you won't answer. But from now on, the Son of Man will be seated in the place of power at God's right hand." They all shouted, "So are you claiming to be the Son of God?" And he replied, "You say that I am." "Why do we need witnesses?" they said. "We ourselves heard him say it." So the first trial, Jesus is brought before the Sanhedrin. This is a group made up of the chief priests and the teachers of the law. Think of it as the religious Supreme Court of the day. They hold a lot of authority. They interpret the law. They make big decisions. But there's a problem. Because Rome is in charge, they don't actually have the authority to impose the death sentence. So even though they've already decided they want Jesus gone, what they need to do in this trial is build a case that will stick when they hand him over to Rome. But the truth is, they don't have a case. The charges aren't holding up, so they start to go after something else. They go after his identity. If you're the Christ, tell us. It's not an honest question. They're not trying to understand him. They're trying to trap him. They're looking for something that they can use against him in the next scene. And what's striking here is how Jesus responds. He doesn't argue. He doesn't defend himself. He doesn't try to convince them. Instead, he says, from now on, the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of God. It's not defensive language. It's a declaration. He's pointing all the way back to their scriptures, to Psalm 110. He's talking about authority, about being enthroned, about who he really is. And then he says, you say that I am. That echoes all the way back to Exodus when Moses asks God, who should I tell them sent me? And God says, I am. In other words, Jesus isn't trying to win an argument in that moment. He's simply telling the truth about who he is. Scene number 2, Jesus before Pilate, living with nothing to hide. In the political world of that day, Caesar was Lord, worshipped as a god. And Pilate was his local ambassador appointed as governor over Jerusalem. Let's continue. Then the entire council took Jesus to Pilate, the Roman governor. They began to state their case. This man has been leading our people astray by telling them not to pay their taxes to the Roman government and by claiming he is the Messiah, a king. So Pilate asked him, are you the king of the Jews? Jesus replied, you have said it. Pilate turned to the leading priests and to the crowd and said, I find nothing wrong with this man. Then they became insistent. But he is causing riots by his teaching wherever he goes, all over Judea, from Galilee to Jerusalem. Oh, is he a Galilean? Pilate asked. When they said that he was, Pilate sent him to Herod Antipas because Galilee was under Herod's jurisdiction. And Herod happened to be in Jerusalem at that time. So they bring Jesus from the religious court to the civil court with Pilate. And when they do, you can feel the shift there immediately. The conversation changes because now they're not talking about theology anymore. They're talking politics. Suddenly the accusations sound different. Now he's subverting the nation. He's telling people not to pay taxes. He's claiming to be a king. They're trying to frame Jesus as a threat, not to the religious system, but to Rome. Because Pilate doesn't care about their religious debates. He cares about order. He cares about control. He cares about anything that might look like rebellion against Caesar. So Pilate looks at Jesus and asks a very direct question. Are you the king of the Jews? And Jesus responds the same way that we saw him before. Calm, measured, not defensive. You say so. No long explanation, no attempt to clear his name, and Pilate can see it. He turns to the crowd, and for the first time of what will be 3 separate declarations, he says, I find no basis for a charge against this man. In other words, I don't see a case here. But the pressure's building, and the crowd is not backing off. So Pilate does what people in power sometimes do when they don't want to deal with something. They pass the buck. He kicks the can to someone else and hopes it becomes someone else's problem. He hears that Jesus is from Galilee, and that suddenly gives him an out. Because there's another ruler, Herod, who oversees that region, and conveniently for Pilate, Herod happens to be in town. So Pilate sends Jesus to him, hoping that maybe this will become someone else's problem. Scene 3, Jesus before Herod, living with nothing to prove. Herod was delighted at the opportunity to see Jesus because he had heard about him and had been hoping for a long time to see him perform a miracle. He asked Jesus question after question, but Jesus refused to answer. Meanwhile, the leading priests and teachers of religious law stood there shouting their accusations. Then Herod and his soldiers began mocking and ridiculing Jesus. Finally, they put a royal robe on him and sent him back to Pilate. So Jesus stands before Herod, and Herod's really excited about this. Frankly, it's the best thing that's happened to him all week. Not because he's searching for truth, but because he's wanting a show. He's heard about Jesus, he's heard the stories, and now finally, he's going to get a front row seat. He wants to see something, a miracle, a sign, something impressive. So he starts asking questions over and over again, but Jesus gives him nothing. Notice how different that is from the first two scenes. No answers at all. None. No miracle, no defense, just silence. And it's a striking contrast with Herod. Herod is talking, questioning, pushing, trying to get something out of Jesus, but Jesus says nothing at all. And it's not that he doesn't have anything to say, it's that Herod is not in a place to hear it. Because this isn't about truth for Herod. It's about curiosity at best. It's about entertainment and control. He wants to see, but he doesn't actually see. He wants to hear, but he isn't really listening. And Luke is showing us something deeper here. The problem isn't that Jesus is hidden. The problem is that Herod isn't open. Because throughout the Gospels, the people who truly see Jesus are the ones who come with humility and openness, with a willingness to follow. Herod's coming as a spectator, and spectators don't get revelation. So Jesus remains silent. And that silence would have been shocking. Because in that world, if you were brought before a ruler, you spoke. You defended yourself. You made your case. Philosophers would argue, prophets would pronounce judgment, but Jesus does neither. Why? Because he isn't that kind of prophet, and he isn't that kind of king. His kingship isn't proven through spectacle. It isn't defended through argument. It's revealed through restraint, through a kind of strength that doesn't need to prove itself. So what looks like weakness is actually strength. What looks like passivity is actually authority. What looks like silence is actually truth being spoken in a different way. Because in this moment, truth is more eloquently stated by silence. And here, friends, is where it comes back to us. Because most of us live like every moment requires a response. That every accusation needs an answer. Every misunderstanding needs to be corrected. Every argument needs to be won. But Jesus shows us another way. A way of living that's so secure in the Father that you don't have to prove anything. Remember what we've already said. With Jesus, I can live with nothing to lose, nothing to hide, nothing to prove. There's one more scene. Scene 4, the choice. Barabbas or Jesus? Then Pilate called together the leading priests and other religious leaders along with the people, and he announced his verdict. You brought this man to me, accusing him of leading a revolt. I have examined him thoroughly on this point in your presence and find him innocent. Herod came to the same conclusion and sent him back to us. Nothing this man has done calls for the death penalty. So I will have him flogged, and then I will release him. Then a mighty roar rose from the crowd, and with one voice they shouted, "Kill him and release Barabbas to us." Barabbas was in prison for taking part in an insurrection in Jerusalem against the government and for murder. Pilate argued with them because he wanted to release Jesus, but they kept shouting, "Crucify him, crucify him." For the third time he demanded, "Why? What crime has he committed? I have found no reason to sentence him to death. So I will have him flogged, then I will release him." But the mob shouted louder and louder, demanding that Jesus be crucified, and their voices prevailed. So Pilate sentenced Jesus to die as they demanded. Pilate brings everyone back together, the religious leaders, the crowd, Jesus standing in the middle of it all, and he essentially says, "I've looked at this from every angle, and I don't see a case here." He says it again, "I found no ground for your charges." Later, a third time, "I find no reason to impose the death penalty." 3 separate times, the Roman governor declares Jesus innocent. But it doesn't matter because the volume of the crowd outweighs the truth in that moment. And Luke uses those three words that I find incredibly sad in this passage. Their shouts prevailed. Evidence didn't prevail. Justice didn't prevail. Not truth, but noise, pressure, fear. Pilate isn't at all convinced that Jesus is guilty. What he is convinced is that the crowd is dangerous. And then the crowd does something that takes things up a notch. They demand Barabbas, and Barabbas is not misunderstood. There's no gray area with this guy. He's guilty, he's violent, he's a known insurrectionist, and yet the crowd chooses him. They choose the one who represents power the way the world understands it, through force, control, and dominance, and they reject Jesus, the innocent one, the quiet one, the one who isn't trying to prove anything. And in that moment, you see two different ways of being human laid side by side. One built on control, the other on surrender. One that needs to win, and one that doesn't have anything to prove. I think if we're honest, this isn't just their story. It's still our temptation. We still struggle with the temptation to choose power over love, control over surrender, being right over being formed. And it's not just ours as individuals. Unfortunately, it's also the story of the church. Henry Nouwen once reflected on this and wrote this: "The long, painful history of the church is the history of people ever and again tempted to choose power over love, control over the cross, being a leader over being led. Those who resisted this temptation to the end and thereby give us hope are the true saints." Because Jesus' way is different. While Caesar, Pilate, and the system rely on power and pressure to get their way, Jesus surrounds himself with the overlooked, the weak, the ones with nothing to offer except their need. And somehow, inexplicably, that's where the kingdom shows up. Because fast forward from that day where Caesar is Lord and Jesus is condemned, over 2,000 years later, look at the movement of Jesus. And Caesar is only remembered by a salad. Some of you, it took a second. Here's the tension this creates for us. When we live like every moment requires a response, like every accusation needs to be corrected, that every misunderstanding needs cleared up, every argument needs to be won, we live more like the crowd. But Jesus stands there fully innocent and doesn't defend himself. He absorbs it. And you want to know why that's good news for us? Because it means that my worth doesn't come from winning every verdict. I don't have to be right in every conflict to be secure. I don't have to live exhausted trying to prove myself. Because sometimes, friends, the story about you has already been written by someone else. The system has already decided. The room isn't interested in truth. And in those moments, your question shouldn't be, how do I win my way out of this thing? The question should be, am I secure enough in who I am in the Father to remain calm and non-defensive even when this doesn't go my way? Because with Jesus, I can live with nothing to lose, nothing to hide, and nothing to prove. I was listening to a podcast with John Ortberg recently, and he told a story about his mentor, Dallas Willard. And if you haven't heard that name, Dr. Willard was a brilliant academic. He was a philosopher. He was a long-tenured professor and dean at the University of Southern California. He won all sorts of awards as a teacher and author, and he was just simply regarded as brilliant. But in a rare combination of virtues, Dallas was also incredibly kind and wise. People seemed just as drawn to him as a person as they were to him as a professor. And his ambition in life was to follow Jesus in living a life of love. So that sets up the story that John Ortberg told. One time, another professor was visiting Dr. Willard's classroom to watch him lecture. And right before the class ended, a student raised his hand. And at first he asked a question, but then he raised a flat-out objection and then a full-on rejection of everything that Willard had ever taught. Not only did he attack the arguments, he began to attack Willard as a person. That foolishly confident student didn't stop with a simple argument. He rudely insulted Dr. Willard's knowledge. And his barrage of offensive words continued for far too long. That visiting professor stood there and held his breath because he knew at any moment the Dr. Dallas Willard, author, dean, PhD, he was going to completely and absolutely verbally slay this college punk and put him back in his place. And the silence hung in the air for what seemed like an eternity. The student sat down, and after a few quiet moments, Dr. Willard collected his notes. He looked up at the class, and he said, "This seems like a good place to end today. I'll see you next week." And the class shuffled quietly out the door. The visiting professor came rushing up to Dallas at the front of the lecture hall. I said, "Why in the world did you do that? You know and I know that student was completely wrong, and not only that, he was really insulting you. Why didn't you let him have it? Why didn't you at least correct him, tell the truth, and put him back in his place?" And Dallas chuckled, and he took a deep breath, and he replied really quietly, saying, "I was simply practicing the discipline of not having the last word." I was practicing the discipline of not having the last word. I think that's where this moves from being a powerful story about Jesus to something much more personal for us, because it isn't just something that happened back then. This shows up in our lives all the time. It shows up in conversations, in disagreements, in moments where we feel misunderstood and misrepresented. It shows up when something rises up in us and says, "I need to say something here. I need to explain. I need to make sure they understand." And to be clear, there are moments where that's appropriate. There are times when the truth needs to be spoken, where love requires clarity, where silence would actually be avoidance. But if we're willing to be honest about our own hearts, we also know that a lot of the time it's not really about the truth. It's about wanting to be seen a certain way. It's about wanting to make sure we're not perceived as wrong. It's about holding on to a sense of control and trying to manage and manipulate how the story ends. And what Jesus shows us in these moments is a different way of living. He shows us what it looks like to live with a kind of security that doesn't require constant defense. The only way Jesus could stand there, accused, misunderstood, ultimately condemned, and remain quiet, is because he knew who he was in his Father. His identity was never up for debate in that moment. It wasn't dependent on the outcome of the trials or the opinions of the crowd. And I think that's the invitation for us today, that we might begin to live with that same kind of security, to trust that our identity is not something that we have to prove in every conflict or conversation, but something that's we've already received in Christ, that we're loved, that we're forgiven, that we're secure, not because we defend ourselves well, but because Jesus gave himself for us. So for some of us, the next step in that is simply to begin letting go of the need to always be right. To pay attention to those moments where we feel the urge to defend or correct or control, and instead to pause and trust God with those moments. To recognize that not every moment requires a response, not every misunderstanding needs to be fixed, and not every argument needs to be won. And for others, that might go even deeper, beyond that need to have the last word, because underneath that constant need to prove yourself is a deeper question about your identity. And maybe you've been trying to answer that question through your performance, through your words, or your ability to hold everything together. And the invitation for you is to stop striving and simply receive what Jesus has already done for you. So as the worship team comes back up, I want to give you a moment to consider where you are in this story, to take a posture of surrender before God about maybe your need to have the last word, or your confusion about your identity in Jesus. Maybe the simplest prayer you can pray is the one that we heard Jesus pray last week. Your will be done, not mine, yours. Because with Jesus, we can begin to live with nothing to lose, nothing to hide, and nothing to prove. Let's stand together and pray. Jesus, as I read these trials before the Sanhedrin, before Pilate, before Herod, I'm amazed at your choosing when to speak and when not to speak. And I know I desire that in my own life. And my guess is that for many gathered here or watching online, that's true for them as well. So in the places that we feel the urge to correct, to set the record straight, to try to control the outcome, to win the argument, would you help us simply to trust you with those moments? Would you give us the grace of knowing when to speak and when to be silent? And for those of us that this goes a lot deeper than the urge to have the last word, would you remind us today that our fundamental identity, the core of who we are, that no story that has been written about us, no perception that's there, no verdict that's already been rendered, no matter how untrue, can change the fundamental identity that we have as your children. People with infinite worth. So would you help us today to lay aside the need to have the last word and to live fully secure in our identity as children of God and persons of worth? Jesus, would you teach us when to speak and when to remain silent? As we go deeper into this journey of following a humble, crucified Savior, Jesus, would you help us to be more like you? It's in your name that we pray. Amen. So as we sing this song, if you want to come to the altar and pray about your need to speak up or your identity, the altar's open for you. If you want somebody to pray with you, lift a hand and someone from the team will do that. Let's worship together.